What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Well, Larry Rifkin and John Krofsik back with you, an episode of America Trends that is sure to rank high on your list of favorites. Right, John?
Yeah, is that, are you trying to give us a hint there?
Well, I think that's the first reference that we're going to be making today to the topic at hand, because you can use all kinds of language to remind people of, well, we're talking, what should I say it? Should I just say it? We're talking about cannabis, and we're talking about the business of cannabis. And John, I mean, I know your roommate in college probably said to you that he could make a living doing this.
Dave's not here.
Dave's not here, man. But that was a long time ago.
That sure was.
And it was a different kind of business. And it was done quietly as people were jacket to jacket out in the cold, looking at each other and looking askance. But we're talking now about the legalization, which, as you know, John, not because you know, but because you're reading about it. It's going on across the country in different places.
Yeah, I guess California just went legal in the new year.
I
don't know. I just, I honestly don't think people should go to jail for it, but I don't know about this legalization. I don't know if, I still haven't figured out if is this a harmless drug or is this a drug that, I've known some people who maybe they seemed too intelligent before marijuana.
Yeah.
I didn't know them then, but
why are you looking at me like that? Well, John, look at it this way. First of all, let's go back to medical marijuana. I think a lot of people recognize that as we're fighting this scourge of opioids, that maybe we've got something here in medical marijuana. And, of course, the state in which we reside, we have already legalized the medical part, and we're expanding the number of conditions that are covered by it. What do you think about the medical marijuana piece?
They can extract the part out, so you're not getting high from it. You're just getting the benefit. So, and time will tell if that really works. But I think it's better than, I don't know, just smoking marijuana. Just I don't know. It just.
Well, how different is it from alcohol? Now, I know a lot of people say, well, with alcohol, you have one drink, it's social, or two. But when you do look at alcohol and the abuse of it in our society and the detrimental impacts of alcohol, I think it's hard to argue that even though it's been underground for many, many years, weed or cannabis, it's been widely used. And I look at somebody who's drunk as being a lot more of a menace than somebody who's stoned. I've got to admit that.
Well, I don't know. Time will tell with that, too. I mean, are you a hazard smoking while driving? I mean, we don't know. We really don't know, and I guess we're going to find out. But
well, it's pretty good now because now, as we have pointed out with other podcasts, they're going to be driverless cars.
Well, that's true. That'll save that whole problem.
So you can smoke, drink. You can have a party in the back seat. It won't really matter. But John,
as long as you don't get one of those fatal errors on your computer.
So, John, put this in your pipe and smoke it. I mean, we're looking at cannabis. We're looking at the plant.
Right.
This is what people call it. Some call it the medicine, the weed,
marijuana,
the digestible, the oils. I mean, it comes in many forms. And truly, the reason that we're dealing with it is because it is societally very important, and it's growing as an industry remarkably. I mean, as we get into this podcast, some of the products that it has already eclipsed in terms of sales is absolutely stunning when it's only legal in a couple of states.
Well, I agree. I think also hemp, which is part of the marijuana plant, is very useful and can probably save us a lot with some materials that you can produce with it. So
yeah, a lot of people have used hemp over the years. But, we get a little giggly about this topic. And I will say that when we were recording this with Takiya Anthony-Price, the founder of One-on-One, she does a podcast about the weed, the plant, the oils, the digestibles.
Yeah,
and she is in a state where they have just legalized it, and the business is about to come online. And she thinks her state, which is Massachusetts, is really going to handle it in ways different than perhaps Colorado did or even California, because they're adding a real technology piece to all of this. And you've got a lot of seminars going on with groups like MIT and Harvard and all of these folks getting into how do we make this business a good business for many people who have really been caught up in the war on drugs. A lot of people in the poor communities who have been ravaged by drugs, or ravaged by the police action against drugs.
Right.
Well, how do they benefit from this?
Well, I think the whole drug culture we got to look at. I think we've lost the war on drugs. I mean, let's face it, that's been a losing battle since the 70s.
I'm so glad that Nancy Reagan did not hear what you just said, John.
I think, though, it really is a social problem, and I think we need to figure out how to deal with it. And, should people be going to jail for this stuff? I mean, I don't know. It's, look at all the people that are on legal drugs that are, misusing them. I mean, it's just...
Well, maybe our
difficult.
society just needs a real good talking to itself about all the things that we're ingesting for a whole range of reasons, including things that have been legal for a long time. I mean, look at the opioid problem that we have and the fact that there are many legal companies, good citizens of the business community who were taking advantage of a situation, and they had the research.
Yes, they do.
They knew what was going to
knew.
happen.
Yep.
So there are so many things that we need a good talking to ourselves about. But right now we're talking about California. We're talking about Colorado, and they are all in, John. I mean, you've got entrepreneurs developing all kinds of businesses.
They are all in because they see it. It's a cash cow. I mean, hopefully they do right by it, and they're not just there to collect the tax money.
Well, look, when you think about all the businesses, honestly, that are spawned by this, you're talking about the growing, you're talking about the distributing, you're talking about the educating, and the potential for big money is staggering. However, John, there is one huge impediment in all of this.
What's that?
Well, it's that the feds have not recognized it, so it still is illegal under federal law. So banks and credit card companies and others can't get involved. Or R.J. Reynolds or some of these companies that would love to jump into this, they can't at this moment in time.
Interesting place to be.
Yeah. I mean, look, the cigarette companies who've been losing market share,
right?
They'd love to find a product like this. That's why so many have gone into vaping and all of these other things. But this would be huge. I mean, it's a smoking industry, John. I mean, it is. How many of these references are we going to make? So when we look at this, the state of Massachusetts, how are they going to go about this? And I actually went up to a seminar that my daughter held for young African-American entrepreneurs up in Boston as to how they might get involved. Look, it's going to be legal.
Right.
Somebody's going to be making money. And this community has been devastated in many ways. So they're looking to make certain that the distribution and the growing are separate, so it can't be vertically integrated as a business.
Right. Okay.
That's what they're trying to do so that a lot of people can benefit financially. If it's going to be there, just put it out there for people to benefit.
Right. Let everybody get a piece of the action.
Yeah, that's what they're looking at in Massachusetts. Now, how well that's going to work, I don't know. But again, I think Takiya is going to help us because she's really been studying what it is that they're attempting to do. And again, it hasn't gone online as of the taping of this podcast, but you'll get a good sense of what she thinks is going to happen and what they've learned from other states.
Well, let's get her on here.
All right.
I'm interested.
All right. To walk us through all of this, Takiya Anthony-Price. And again, her podcast is focused on cannabis. She's got a very specific target that she's got. You and I, we kind of talk about all kinds of things, John. Maybe we need to get a little more focused.
Focus.
You think if we Smoked, would that help us?
Oh, I don't know.
know.
We'll have to try it on a podcast one time.
No, let's not. I don't know. Well, her organization, her business, her podcast is called One-on-One. Yes, One-on-One. And she's with us today on America Trends. Takiya, Massachusetts, where you reside, has legalized recreational marijuana. What has your state learned about the business from earlier legalization efforts in places like Colorado?
Well, it's twofold. I think what Massachusetts did very well was when it was put on the ballot to vote for in 2015 and eventually became, in 2016 eventually became law, in 2016. It became law in 2016, and it was put on the ballot earlier that year. I think all of the mistakes that were made in Denver, Colorado, and certainly in D.C. Were things that were taken into account. You know, we wanted a program that was very inclusive of minorities, very inclusive of communities that have been disproportionately affected by the war on drugs. We also saw it as an opportunity not for bigger conglomerates to come in from, California or come in from Colorado, but, have people who are able to cultivate their own small economy here and be part of the industry here. For example, within the provisions of how the law was written, it allows for cooperative growing, and cultivating. So there are people who are great growers but have been growing underground for quite some time. They also have the opportunity to buy a license to cultivate and do exactly what they've been doing on the black market and do it on, the right side and pay their taxes and do this for a living. That's not an opportunity that is allowed in places like Colorado and D.C., who have their own flaws in their laws.
Well, let's look at what they did and then go to what Massachusetts is, because we really want to look at the business of cannabis. There are a lot of people who say, well, some of the big folks are looking at this with great interest, but because you can't get credit card companies and you can't get some financial institutions involved because of their more national charter, and it's still against the law federally, that some of the players who really want to get into this have been reluctant to date. What really did happen in Colorado that you want to either mirror or avoid?
I think the aspect of it being a place where only monopolies can exist and people who have, make great cannabis may not come from a mass production background, may not have a business degree, may not be as business oriented as say, the big Walmart of cannabis in Denver. But what it does is, with Massachusetts, it provides an opportunity for people who just want to grow and, if they are interested in perhaps opening up a retail space or opening up a manufacturing place, they can also do that. But the market here is it's no longer going to be vertically integrated, so it's going to be very segmented. So if you're a grower and that's all you know what to do, you can get a license to just grow, and that can be your business.
So are you saying that in Colorado it is more vertically integrated, where somebody who's growing is also doing the dispensing, and therefore they've kind of tied up, all of the production and the distribution?
Off the top of my head, I don't know if they are vertically integrated, but what I can say is that people who may not have the finances to do it on the bigger
scale,
like on the bigger stand, can't participate in that industry. And it's unfortunate because some of the best growers or some of the best cannabis I've ever consumed have come from, my local grower, not some big dispensary that's doing on mass production that has room for error because, you're not taking the time to really cultivate that 1 or 2 or 3 plants that you have. You have to take care of 1,200 square feet of plants, So it's not unusual. It happens in any industry where there's mass production. Not every single product you get is going to be like the perfect batch, but for those who make it their life's work to just cultivate and provide the plant matter as medicine to people locally in small batches, have the opportunity to do that here, and I think that's pretty impressive.
And what about quality control? I mean, a lot of people today are worried that the marijuana of the days when I was a younger person back in the 70s, it was much weaker then, much stronger today, and some people worry about what it's being cut with. The legalization of it in Massachusetts, how much safer will that make the product for people who want to consume?
Well, that's something that's still being designed and figured out. We have the law to pass it to become recreationally, but every part of the way, the Cannabis Control Commission is making it a point to speak to their constituents and making it a point to speak to local growers and get the feel on what people want to see as a quality control program. I think in order to really do this well and do it right by the people, you need to speak to them, and that's something they've been doing for the past several weeks, having listening sessions all over the state of Massachusetts, getting input from anybody within that neighborhood or zip code that wants to, just give feedback on what they would like to see the industry shaped as. For example, I think what's going to make us totally different and differentiate us from any other industry is that we are on the East Coast, and the way that we do things is very transactional. I think that although there is a cannabis lifestyle, I'm not debating whether or not there will be one here, but I think that it will be as transactional as going to Target or going to Trader Joe's or going to your local pharmacy and picking up your medicine and you're just gone. And I don't think that's going to change on the recreational side. What I think is going to be really powerful for Massachusetts and really set the tone for what the cannabis industry is going to look like and shape into 5 to 10 years from now. I recently just went to a pitch contest, two pitch contests, and the majority of the people who were partaking and participating in it were people who were interested in the tech industry. So I think if there is anything to be said about what is going to shape out to be the cannabis industry, it's going to be very ancillary. It's going to be very not really touching the plant products and services that make the efficiency and the consumption easier for consumers to have in their hands.
When you look at the micro brewers that are developing all around the country, and ultimately some of them are very successful, but they're successful on a very localized or regional basis. A few are then gobbled up and consumed by the large players, and there are large players, obviously, in that business. Do you see a time when America legalizes it in many more states that an Anheuser-Busch of cannabis really does develop? What do you see happening? Because when I read the sales numbers, they're pretty astounding, that in 2016, the sales of medical and recreational cannabis surpassed revenue generated from Viagra and Cialis already. And there's only a few states that we're really talking about here.
So I have this conversation, frankly, with quite a few people often enough, and is siloed as we are state by state with cannabis and what the industry looks like, I have no problem admitting that once it goes mainstream, there will be a bigger push for a conglomerate to pretty much take their stake in this industry. People don't want to see it, but that's the reality of commerce. This is an industry, like I've said that word several times in this conversation. This is an industry just like any other industry, and I imagine there will be a Budweiser, a Coors Light of cannabis eventually. Whether it happens in 5 years, that's to be determined. Whether it happens in 10 years, that's also to be determined. But I think regardless of it happening, I think you just want to, wherever you create an industry, you want to have everyone have equal footing in participating in the industry. I have no problem with it eventually becoming, the next big .com. That's the reality. It will happen. People who are utterly disgusted by it do not like progress, do not like change. but that's just the reality.
Well, when you go to Marijuana Business Daily,
mm-hmm.
I mean, they're saying that this year cannabis could eclipse popular snack foods like Doritos, Cheetos, as well
mm-hmm.
as ice cream. I mean, so you're talking about something that has got to have many who do processed foods salivating in terms of the potential.
Yeah.
And they go along very well with cannabis.
Yeah, a lot of other sectors want to get into this industry. You have your tobacco sector who want to get into this industry. You have apparel that want to get into this industry via hemp. You have a lot of people who are waiting on legislation to change federally, like state by state. That's great, but to really make a push, if you are, as big as Marlboro, you need it to be federally regulated. And until that happens, I don't think any big company is going to take a stake. So for right now, what you're going to see are a lot of people who have money to burn, venture capitalists who are very interested and hungry to get into this industry. And, they'll take a chance on whatever seems feasible and seems scalable. Whether that becomes something that overtakes this entire market is one thing, but it's inevitable. And I don't see it stopping anytime soon.
Well, I heard the Attorney General of the United States the other day, and he was in front of a congressional panel, and he was asked about marijuana, and he said, well, we're happy to kind of let it go as it is today, state by state, where they can do what they want to do, but it's still not going to be referenced, acknowledged, and authorized, if you will, by the federal
mm-hmm.
government. How much is that a limiting factor in terms of allowing some of this innovation to go on, as you say, at the state level, because the big players and the big money really will stand on the sidelines until that federal seal of approval
mm-hmm.
is put on this?
I think innovation happens as a result of problems and barriers. So what people, for the first few years of cannabis, when it became legalized in Colorado in 2012, was everybody was so focused on touching the plant. So creating edibles, creating, the best dispensary possible, growing the best CBD strains possible. But as you noted, with regulations, you can't necessarily take what you do in Colorado over to Massachusetts or to D.C. or to Oregon. So what do people do in the meantime? Well, you still want to own and operate a business. Well, you think of problems and solutions in a different way where you're not taking all the risk and touching the plant. So you have ancillary businesses. There, for example, you have the decarboxylator through Ardent. It is essentially a decarboxylator that decarbs your medicine so you can make your edibles, and so you're not burning off all of the cannabinoids and terpenes and everything that goes into having a full experience with cannabis with a machine. But this machine, it's an ancillary product. So you created something that works for people without touching the plant. You have people who are popping up and they're becoming experts within the industry or consultants who can, write your business plan for how you open up a dispensary because they have experience with that. Or you have people who are working in the marketing sector of the cannabis world who are basically taking what marketing and advertisement is for the 21st century and applying it to cannabis. It's not your typical hippie. It's not your typical stoner. The consumers are savvy. They're C-level executives. They're full-fledged adults who have money, indispensable money to use, and they want to have an experience with the cannabis. So it's not what it used to be. And I think if you take the approach of looking at cannabis as any other product or service, you can certainly come up with something that doesn't necessarily have to touch the plant. You don't have to be in the cannabis industry and just be a dispensary. Like, there's so many other things that you
Well, let's talk about that. And how much is transferable, not just state by state, and there are difficulties, as you presented them to us, Takiya, about doing that, but from the medical component And where we are now broadcasting or podcasting, we have it legally applied here in Connecticut in terms of the medical piece. We don't have the recreational side, though it has been decriminalized.
You will be soon.
Well, it's likely. I mean, it's likely. But having said that, how much are we going to be looking at what's happened on the medical side and transferring that to the recreational side?
State by state, I think what people are realizing is that how stringent the regulations are for the medical side. I would imagine any challenges that you've had with the medical side, for example, like with Connecticut, my understanding there are 22 diagnoses that
well, they keep adding to it, and the program has gone rather smoothly. We've heard very little of some of the concerns. We have a couple of growing operations here in our region. We have a number of dispensaries, and lots of people were imagining problems, but it's been rather quiet.
Okay, that's great. In some cases, some people have really slow or really stringent medical programs in their states. Massachusetts, there was a lot of advocacy on changing it while it was already enacted, making sure that people can consume or get more medicine than what was initially written into law. So I think no matter what medical program you have or whatever recreational program you have, it gets voted into law, but there's still advocacy that needs to be done to make sure that everything that your constituents and voters wanted gets implemented. And in some cases, people want to tweak things. And as any other industry, you hear the fascination with how plentiful and how much there is to make in the cannabis industry. And people sometimes are like, well, let's up the taxes based off of, what we've read or what we've heard or what someone's told us about how much cannabis actually is worth. And if your medical consumers can't afford that, they can barely make it to the dispensary. It doesn't really serve them. It's not self-serving. What I think is changing is that people are definitely doing a better job, at least in Massachusetts, is separating the recreational side from the medical side, but still having the same entity overseeing it. With us, we have the Cannabis Control Commission that's doing just that. It's no longer our Department of Health, which has 20 other thousands of things to be concerned about in Massachusetts' health sector. So we have a dedicated team of experts and people who understand the cannabis industry, solely focused on it.
But how many of the players in the medical field want to move over to the recreational field and become dominant overall with the product, the handling of it, the growing of it, the dispensing of it, or is it going to be a separate group of people interested in one or the other?
Well, it's interesting that you say that. So as the law was passed, the medical dispensaries have first dibs on the licenses. My understanding is no one is opting out of going in that direction. Like, it wouldn't make financial sense to say, no, we're strictly going to be selling medicinal when the recreational has been proven. The recreational side of cannabis is very lucrative. So it would be a disservice not to participate in it. My understanding is every single one of them will be in Massachusetts. It also, they are able to get their licenses first, and it also opens up to the public for anybody else who's interested in also, getting a dispensary as well.
Well, reading what the business is really about, medical marijuana dispensaries and the recreational cannabis stores are pretty sound. I mean, when you think about it, the average profit margins coming in around 19%. What is it that you're telling people who are interested in Massachusetts that they can expect? How hard, how long before they turn profits? What are they thinking? Or are they thinking this is the new gold rush?
I always tell people in conversation, it's a very arduous process. It's not as simple. For medical, at least what we've seen. Ideally with recreational and how the program is set to run, I think it will not be as arduous as it has been. For medical, it could have been, 2 2 to 3 year process, making sure that you have all your finances put together. Zoning is a big issue, especially in the city of Boston. You know, finding space for a dispensary, having a town vote whether or not they want that in their town, want a dispensary or a grow facility in their city. All these things take time, and like local politics, it moves slowly. So you have to be prepared for the long haul. You have to have your finances very up to date. It's not for the faint of heart.
Okay, and where is the money, as you see it, going to be made? Is it going to be in the cultivation businesses? Is it going to be more in the dispensaries, the rec shops? Is it going to be with the infused product and all the cannabinoids and, you know, some of these ancillary products? Where do you think the money is going to be?
For Massachusetts, I honestly think and this is my intuition, I think it's definitely going to be in the ancillary products and services.
And what are those ancillary products for those who are listening who may not really have a clue as to what we're talking about, in addition to product that somebody might smoke or ingest to get high? What are we talking about here?
I'm talking about banking systems. I'm talking about technology used for cultivating. I'm talking about marketing, I'm talking about research, I'm talking about education. All of those things, I think, we are a very innovative state, and we love tech. we definitely love tech in Massachusetts, and we also are very prevalent in health and education in those sectors as well, and I think there's going to be a heavy push for both of those.
Well, let me ask you, how does an MIT get involved, or how does a Harvard or Brigham and Women's Hospital? In other words, how are these institutions going to touch this new industry or be touched by it?
Well, it's a fantastic question. BU just hosted a pitch night. They partnered with an alumni who owns a consulting business in Colorado, and he was interested in seeing what the industry could look like in Massachusetts, and so he opened up with BU a pitch competition, and there were at least 120 applicants. They narrowed it down to 5 people who were vying for $10,000, and the winner ended up being I forget the name of the organization, but they were concerned about the research and information education about cannabis not living in one central area. So they're dedicated to essentially making a Wikipedia of cannabis that can be shared in open source with anybody within the cannabis community.
When you look at cannabis and you look at, aside from these ancillary businesses that you think will spin off from it, what are the other impacts on entertainment, on travel, on housing, food? I mean, are you seeing where this new industry is going to touch a lot of other industries that may be totally unrelated, but people coming in to be tourism of cannabis, consumers? What do you see happening in Massachusetts, and how quickly?
As I noted earlier, I don't think we necessarily have like a cannabis lifestyle brand. Or stoner mentality. I think it's very transactional. I don't see having a cannabis tour of all the dispensaries and the local neighborhoods.
Like they do with microbreweries. You don't see that.
Yeah, I don't see that happening. It's possible. It's very well possible. I wouldn't put it past us, but I think there's going to be a heavy, heavy focus on technology. We have MIT, we have Harvard, we have Northeastern, we have quite a few schools that are heavily focused and have stake in this industry, and there's a I believe it's the University of Michigan that now has a cannabis degree that you can receive. You can study cannabis. So I don't think we are going to not lean into the cannabis industry. How we go about doing it, that's to be determined. But I think that Massachusetts is a really interesting ecosystem of innovators, and I only can see most, if not all, of the leading innovation in this industry actually
coming out of Massachusetts.
Starting off in Massachusetts, yeah.
Takiya Anthony-Price is with us one-on-one. We're talking about the business of cannabis, and I think a lot of people would wonder, when is it coming to a theater near you? In other words, how quickly is this going to move across the country as you see it? The various initiatives, referendums, legislature, and their activities. Where do you see this business going over what period of time?
My business or cannabis?
Cannabis overall.
I think it's going to get overhauled in a sense where it's no longer going to live in a really unapproachable manner. I think it's going to get overhauled and be very accessible to people from varying demographics, whether it be gender, race, or age. For example, there's a brand of cannabis that basically renamed their type of their weed, their flower, with the moods that you want to exist in when consuming it. So you have your sleepy flowers, you have your creativity flowers. Renaming them. We can't send our grandmother to the dispensary and say, "Hey, make sure you get that like train wreck or Incredible Hulk." Like that's very intimidating. So I think rebranding cannabis is exactly what you're going to see, and it's going to become the next scale of the health sector.
And what about these oils and the other things that are now being looked upon as being derivative, but very, very different than the way the product is used today? Is that going to be a burgeoning part of this industry as you see it?
I think so as well. I think that it's a little bit more accessible. It's easier to maybe take a tincture, couple of drops on your way to work than it is to necessarily vape if you have a no smoking policy. Also, still smoking cannabis for some people is very taboo. Vaping it is still just as taboo because of the smell. I think what concentrates and other topicals do, it allows you to consume it in very open spaces without people even knowing that you are using cannabis. So I think that's definitely going to be playing a pivotal role in how we look at cannabis, how we see cannabis, how people who may have no longer stop using cannabis but want to return back to it and be very discreet. I think that's a big focus on cannabis as a whole, is just being discreet in your consumption of however you're taking it.
Well, what about that taboo and people who don't want to go back to it, or maybe do, but don't want to make it a big lifestyle, aspect of their being, as they might have back in college? So I know that I noticed that a lot of the people who talk about it, because I've been up in Massachusetts with you at an event that my daughter was running about the business and entrepreneurship, but, a lot of people call it the plant or the herb. A lot of people don't want to really, say marijuana or pot or whatever. I mean, the labeling of this and the stigma or not of it, I'm just curious about that aspect, because in Colorado, I was told recently at an event that I went to that they are now a little bit worried that there are, perhaps signs that perhaps they need to regulate this a little bit more, that maybe there have been more driving accidents. I mean, do you see any pushback against the accessibility of cannabis?
No, I really don't. It's the same aspect of alcohol, treated like alcohol. It's, the more you prohibit it, the more people are going to want it. They're still going to consume it. That doesn't change. You always have a set of bad apples in the bunch who are drunk driving. You have a set of people who are under the influence of cannabis who perhaps should not be driving after consuming cannabis. So I don't think there's any increase. I feel like what people are frightened of are things that this isn't well studied, so people don't know much about cannabis. And based off of that and all of the 60 to 80 years of propaganda and miseducation, we're still coming out of that and re-educating people on the fact that it's a plant. It's a plant that has been around for thousands of years, and other cultures have consumed it for more than that. And it's I think 50% of your time when you're talking to consumers and or people who are curious about it is educating them on what it is and not what it isn't. The other 50% is, okay, now that you know what it is, what can we do to implement it into your routine? Do you like to vape? Do you like to smoke? Do you have aches and pains? Like, do you like topicals? Things of that nature. So I imagine that the alcohol industry after Prohibition went through the same process, and look at us now.
Well, let's talk about the health and safety. Let's talk about the health and safety for just a moment. And let me do it on two fronts. One being that there are people out there today still in the illegal market who may be cutting certain cannabis with fentanyl and other properties that really people don't imagine that they are going to be partaking in, and yet unknowingly are. Could that be an impetus to drive more legalization and regulation?
I think it definitely could. Cannabis is so easily accessible in general, and this is coming from someone who has been consuming since high school. So you would find anybody who knew someone who had cannabis. As a young child, you would not, as a young teen, you wouldn't ask many questions. I think because of the internet age and the accessibility, people are more likely to ask questions about what they're consuming. If the person you're receiving it from doesn't know anything, that's a pretty big indication that you probably should not be receiving it or consuming what they're providing you with. That also being said, I think what the recreational market allows people to do is, for those people who have been on the fence about consuming cannabis because of, the sketchy individual who was like, hey, you need to try this strain that we have, or at a party and you didn't really know anything about it, there's now a safe place that you can go to and get a bit of education on what you should be consuming and what quality cannabis looks like. With situations like that, I think opening up a recreational side will help to destigmatize and also re-educate people who may not necessarily be patients, but, they're occasional drinkers or they're occasional dabblers in whatever it is that they're doing, and they're just curious about changing their lifestyle as far as what they do socially. And I think cannabis is a great entry point to do, and I think that the recreational market will certainly serve as that particular place.
Okay, let me talk about health and safety in this regard. A lot of people are very concerned, obviously, about opiates. And opiates, of course, have been used for pain relief. Now, medical marijuana being used for that, and some saying we should move more dramatically in that direction. But you mentioned that this is a plant, but so are poppies, and so are some of the things that we derive from the poppies that have become so addictive. And I've still heard people saying, well, marijuana is a gateway drug. I mean, how do you respond to this, both in relation to opiates as another alternative or a better alternative, and yet they're both plant-derived?
They are both plant-derived, but the difference is that no one has access to poppies to just consume poppies. People have been conditioned to consume medicine that is prescribed by a doctor that has been refined and has other additives in it. Cannabis itself, and the flower itself is easily accessible. You can grow it at home. You can grow it pretty much anywhere and consume it and have all the medicinal necessities that are needed to help with whatever ailment that you might have. It's cleaner. It's healthier. It's just the plant of choice, in my personal opinion. I think there are no side effects that occur when you're consuming cannabis, at least if you're consuming the strain that works better for your body. there were deaths from it. So to me, that's a selling point. You watch a commercial for Zoloft, and at the end of the commercial, there are like 30,000 side effects. You can go blind in one eye, and you could lose feeling and sensation in your right thumb. Cannabis, that's what's the most that could happen. You go to sleep.
We'll return to this episode of America Trends in just a moment. If you like what we're doing here at America Trends Podcast, please don't keep it to yourself. I know there are a lot of people, John, who think, well, if I'm listening and somebody else wants to listen at the same time, maybe we're going to collide and they're not going to be able to hear us.
Yeah.
Is that the way the technology works?
No, there's plenty of bandwidth. Everybody can listen at the same time.
All right. Well, that
sure
dispels that myth. Now, you can do a number of things that would really be helpful to us. You could give us a kind rating or a review at Apple Podcasts, and that boosts what they consider to be our value and visibility. And what does that do, John?
Well, that puts us in the forefront so that you can find us easier, and most important is other people can find us easier.
And you can subscribe there or on our site, americatrendspodcast.com, or wherever you're listening, so we can alert you to new episodes of the podcast, which, by the way, we put out twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And stay in touch with us on both Facebook and Twitter at Trends Podcast. Or you can like us on Facebook or follow us where, John?
On Twitter.
On Twitter, that's right, where the world turns to hear fake news or whatever it is. Well, you can direct message us at Trends Podcast or using hashtag Trends Podcast. And John, with our growing audience, and really it's been pretty remarkable, a lot of people just came to us the last month or two, and they might have missed earlier episodes. Can they get them again?
They can look through them and pick the ones they want to listen to. They're all on the website, and a lot of them are up on iTunes, many of them.
All right. Well, listen, there's lots of material to listen to. We hope you have the time, and we'll lend it to us because we try to make it worth your while. And thanks so much for listening.
And tell your friends.
We now return to this episode of America Trends.
Okay, now let me ask you in closing, if we were having this conversation, Takiya, in 5 years, what are we looking at? I mean, now, of course, we've got states like California, Maine, Massachusetts, Nevada, and then we've got medical industries in places like Arkansas and Florida and Louisiana, North Dakota, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Where do you think this industry is going to be in 5 years?
It depends. I think some major states that are hoping to create a recreational side, say that New York and New Jersey, if they go full-fledged, I think there's going to be a harder push for two heavily populated states that, such as those states. If they were to go legal, I think the rest of the country would sort of topple right behind it. But if those two don't necessarily become legal in the next 2 to 3 years, I think you'll continue to see small victories state by state. That's what I imagine.
Well, do you think there could be any court cases that expedite things, not to make it comparable to gay marriage, but when people thought that was going to take a long time state by state, then ultimately there was a Supreme Court decision that said it was legal because it was very complicated going across states with a marriage license. Was it valid here or there? I mean, what's the possibility that there could be something aside from New York or New Jersey adapting to this that really expedites this process?
Well, there actually is a case. It's a case with a few plaintiffs who, one of which is an organization, Cannabis Cultural Association in New York, as well as I believe there's a football player and a 12-year-old girl who are suing Jeff Sessions to deschedule cannabis altogether. So as far as where it is right now, I think they're still hearing both sides of the case. But I think it's not even the rescheduling, because at this point it's moot. I think descheduling it altogether would be feasible.
And I know that Cory Booker, a senator from New Jersey, has some legislation about marijuana. Where is that along the continuum?
I currently don't know about that, where it is right now, but I know it's still being heard. I would imagine it's hopefully going to be implemented for the 2018 vote, but it's looking good so far. From everything that I've heard, it's looking good so far.
All right. Well, listen, Takiya, I want to thank you for joining us today, one-on-one. Takiya Anthony-Price, she is the founder, the executive producer, and she does a lot of podcasting herself about cannabis. If people want to listen in, Takiya, how do they do that?
Yeah, we are cannabis-centric media series that, have individuals come on and narrate their first time consuming cannabis. And you can find us on our website, one-on-one, both ones are numerical, .stream, or you can also locate us on Apple Podcasts under one-on-one stream, as well as SoundCloud and Stitcher.
All right. I thank you so much for coming by today on America Trends Podcast, and we will follow this story. It's obviously one of the trends in the country, and we appreciate your time today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.